outside this building. We're very grateful. Well, before our lead pastor Kevin comes to close our series, Level Up, would you join me as we pray? And I'll encourage you to maybe do something this morning, whether you want to do it physically or mentally, picture it, is to put your palms up and to be able to say to God, here I am. And again, whether you want to do it physically or just do it mentally, picture that, would you just enter that posture as I pray? And so, Jesus, on a gorgeous week, there are some who are just navigating some very hard times, and others are celebrating with joy. So I come to you, we come to you, palms up, ready to tell you whatever you need me to hear this morning, I'm ready. Speak to us now in whatever way we need. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, T. Well, I was a year out of college when I joined my first small group, and I felt a little bit out of my element. You see, I was in a group with a bunch of couples. There was only one other single. Most of them knew one another, and I was the newbie. But then something happened that began to shift the dynamic. We began to share stories. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to go first because I'd never experienced that, and while there's a lot of ways to share stories, we took a deep dive in that group. One person would go every week, and they would share for an hour to an hour and a half their story and how God had worked in their life. Now, every week that this took place, we went a little deeper, and a little deeper, until one week, somebody took a huge risk. And this one gal took a deep dive in, and she shared something that she was deeply ashamed of that she had done in college. She'd never shared it with anybody. In fact, before group that week, for the very first time, she shared it with her husband. And then she shared it with the small group. And it was like a literal weight came off, and she experienced this incredible sense of healing and forgiveness and freedom. And suddenly, me sharing my story didn't feel so risky anymore. In fact, her sharing her story was an agent of healing and change, not just in her life, but in the lives of many in that small group. And for me, it planted a seed. It planted a seed because I saw how important transformational community was, so much so that 8 years later, I left my marketplace job and came on staff at a church as a small groups pastor. Now, I thought of that story recently because of a question that somebody had asked me, and I was having a conversation with somebody, and they said, why do pastors share so many stories? And so I got thinking about the question, and their focus was, why do pastors share so many stories? Why don't they just teach the Bible? And it really got me thinking, and because it was such a good question, and it's a question that you might have. And it got me thinking about important stories, but it got me thinking about the answer to this question. And I think the reason that we share stories is simply this, because stories challenge and change us. Stories can help us to level up, especially if it's a good story. And we can share stories on Sunday morning. We can share stories in a small group like what I experienced, or we can share, one-on-one with a friend. And it's one of the things that I absolutely appreciate about this story. I think there's a love for story. And as we walk through things and we ask people to share, and as we wrap up our Level Up series, and it's a series, if you're new to this and just jumping in on the end, it's a series where we're being challenged to level up in our relationship with Jesus. And as a wrap up this morning, we're going to look at how stories challenge us and change us. And it's going to look a little different because I'm going to answer that question, but I'm also going to share some stories along the way. So let's dive in. Stories challenge and change us a variety of ways. And the first thing that they do is stories help create connection. And that's why we often begin our messages with a story. And several years ago, and you might remember this if you were here, I shared the butter story, or what's become known as the butter story. And it's a story when Susie and I, my wife, we were first married, And when I grew up, we kept the butter in the refrigerator, and so I would put the refrigerator on the counter, or the butter on the counter, and she would come in the kitchen and go, "Why is the butter on the counter?" And she'd put it in the fridge, and I'd go to the fridge, and I'd find it in there. I'm like, "Who put the butter in the fridge?" And I'd put it back on the counter, and this went on for quite a while. Now, you might think we were a little smarter than that because there's only 2 of us living in the house, so it shouldn't have been that hard to figure out. It's a funny story, but you'd be surprised at how many conversations I've had with people over a silly story about how we handled our butter. Because you see, stories create connection, and they help bridge the gaps between one another. When we share our experiences, our struggles, and our victories, we build community and we deepen relationships. And along the way, we're reminded that we're not alone in this journey. And this is where I'm going to share my first story, because there's a group here at Grace Fishers that's doing a great job of doing this, and it's a group called the Classics. Now, the Classics started out as an older adult group, 65 plus, that meets once a month, and their goal is simply to create a place of connection, to serve one another, and to serve in this church, and then to grow together. It's led by Bob and Kathy Foley, and Lauren and Becky Robertson, and Pam and Trennis Henderson. And it's created a space of welcoming for older adults, but as they say, everybody is welcome. And it's created a space for particularly people often who have moved here after a number of years living somewhere else. And I want to focus this morning on one couple in particular, Merle and Vi Gehrig. Now, Merle and Vi moved here recently within the last year to be closer to family. And this was a huge transition for them because they grew up in small town Illinois, a town you've probably never heard of called Gridley. And they said one of the challenges transitioning from country life to city life is there's so many taillights here. And in fact, Merle said it was so hard to leave friends and involvement there after so many years. And just to give you a taste of what that involvement, it was in the community, but also in their local church. And as a couple, they were invested there in that local church for 60 years. In fact, for Merle, it was 80 years. So it's probably a bit of an understatement to say coming here and starting here at this church feels like starting over. But the cool thing is, in the midst of this transition and trusting God for a move here, they've seen and experienced a number of gifts. Probably the biggest gift is that they get to worship here at Grace Fishers with many of their kids, their grandkids, and even their great-grandkids. And here's a picture of many of them. There's 4 generations of Gehrigs that are worshiping here at Grace Fishers, which is so cool. And being part of the Classics has been a welcoming space that has created a sense of connection. But even cooler than that is what they discovered is their next door neighbor where they live and moved is also part of the Classics. And then the cool thing is God placed another group or another couple in the Classics that were from that small town in Gridley, Illinois, a couple that they'd never known. But what an incredible gift. And by the way, Merle and Vi today are celebrating their 62nd wedding anniversary, and they're sitting right back over there, so let's celebrate them. Happy anniversary. Now, by the way, they have a special connection for me because they lived for all those years about a mile from where my grandfather was born. And so they know a lot of my family, they knew my dad, and it's just a special personal connection for me. But if you've moved here recently and you hear their story, you connect with that and you think, hey, I'm not alone in this transition to a new place and a new church. But stories begin to connect us, but that's not all they do. They also inspire us to level up. Did you know that 40% of the Bible is stories? Jesus himself often shared stories. In fact, the gospel themselves are stories about Jesus, not just about his teaching, but the way he interacted, the way he loved people. And stories are important because it's easier for us to remember stories. And it helps us think about what does it look like to grow in our faith? How are we supposed to act? And sometimes in the scriptures, we see good examples of people that did well. And very often we see bad examples of things that we're not supposed to emulate. but it helps us to think about how are we supposed to level up in our faith. And as I was thinking about that concept, I was thinking about a verse that Josh, our worship leader, shared probably about a month ago from Hebrews chapter 10. And the writer of Hebrews tells us this. He says, "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope that we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. Let us not neglect meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now as the day of his return is drawing near." Now, those last two verses have a lot of words in it, but I want to bring your attention to the two verbs that are in that passage. The two verbs are motivate and encourage. And actually, I'm going to ask Pastor Rob to come up here and help me demonstrate the difference of these words. And these words may not sound that different to us, but motivate is more of a face-to-face word. It means to stir up and to provoke somebody to action. And when we read this word, it means to sharpen. It means like to sharpen a knife, but particularly in the ancient world, it meant to sharpen one person after another. And so when I'm motivating somebody, I'm getting maybe in their face. There's even a little bit of a sense of conflict in this word. And it's probably a word that we need to learn how to live out a little better, because it's probably not a word that I'm as comfortable with. I'm much more comfortable with the second word, which is encourage, which is simply to come alongside, to care, and we're much more comfortable with this. But we need both words in our life. Thanks, Rob, for coming up here. I didn't give him a microphone. He said he had things to say about that as well, but we only need one of us preaching this morning. But there's a lot of ways that we can motivate one another and a lot of ways that we can encourage one another. But one of the ways that we do both of those things is by sharing our stories with one another. And sometimes we're motivated to action, or sometimes we're encouraged in comfort when we hear somebody's story shared with us, and we're inspired to follow in their footsteps. As I was thinking about that, I heard a variety of stories, and I don't have time to share them all, but a few months ago, before my sabbatical, Susie and I had the privilege to gather with some of our international families, and I got to hear some of the stories of their challenges and the courage that they took to move to a new country and to move to a new city and to engage in a new church, and a church that often looks very different than the church that they grew up in. And as I heard their stories, I was challenged to emulate their courage and challenged to get a bigger perspective of the world and to live more boldly. You see, their stories, as I heard them, began to change and challenge me. You see, stories help us to grow, they help us to level up and to live more boldly. And then thirdly, stories help us to celebrate God's work in our midst. You see, sometimes we need a reminder that God is up to something in this world. And a couple of weeks ago, probably some of you were able to attend this, but on a Sunday evening, a number of us gathered to worship and to pray. And Josh, our worship leader, planned the evening, and it was really spectacular. And it was a reminder of God's faithfulness in our midst in a variety of ways. And Josh kind of framed the time around a quote that I shared at the beginning of this series by Pastor Mark Batterson, which was change of pace plus change of place equals change of perspective. And in this auditorium, we changed up our pace as we began to worship. And we had an extended time of worship. And then we began to pray throughout the auditorium, but we slowed down both our worship and our prayer, and we began to listen a little differently. And again, we used the auditorium a little different. There were stations set up. For instance, people walked over the cross and there were cushions, and they would kneel and they would pray. And over here, there was an art and journaling station. And this is a picture of one of the kids that was here. He was drawing an artwork which tells a picture of God's story. There was even a bracelet station out in the entryway, and I learned I'm not very good at making bracelets, so I gave up after a little bit. And then there was a communion station back here in the center. And it was really cool as later I heard the story of the Dean family who for the first time with their hunter, they celebrated communion together as a family. It was Hunter's first communion, and they had space to gather around and to worship and to celebrate communion together. And in that moment, in that space, many of us had a touch from God, and we got a change of perspective, one that I needed in that moment. But my favorite thing about the evening was that all ages were represented. There was young and there were old, and there were high school students that were helping lead this time of worship. In fact, all the pictures that you saw, they were taken by one of our high school students, Eli, who was roaming and taking an incredible set of pictures. And then another of our students, Mika, led through the reading of Scripture in a time of reflection. And then Liam, one of our high school seniors, led us in a time of communion. And I don't know that I've ever experienced one of our students leading us in communion, but it was an incredibly powerful moment for many of us. Because particularly for our kids and student staff who got to see the picture of God's faithfulness lived out in the lives of these students, who themselves have been faithful and their parents have been faithful, but ultimately it was a picture and a reminder of God's faithfulness in their lives. Behind every story is the hand of God, and as we tell our stories, they're not just our stories, but they're testimony to God's faithfulness and love. And then lastly, stories challenge us and change us when we take the risk to share them. And the last thing I want to do today is remind you that your story matters. And I think it's easy for us to think my story is not that interesting or not that challenging, but no story is too small or insignificant. And sometimes we need one another's help to remember that our stories are important. In fact, there's a small group study that says this. It says, in community, we help each other translate our stories into the story of God, revealing our ultimate purpose of partnering in His work of restoration and redemption. Sometimes we need one another to hear our stories afresh. And you see, your story is a signpost to God's faithfulness. And if you don't share your story, the church and the people of God are poorer for it. And I think it's easy for us to look at our lives and look at our stories and say nothing exciting, but maybe in that, your story is a picture of God's faithfulness protecting you from hardship and difficulty. And maybe if you've experienced hardship and difficulty, your story is a picture of God's redemption and care. But every story is important. And by sharing your story, you participate in God's bigger story, offering hope and encouragement, motivation and challenge to others. You see, stories challenge and change us. And in fact, one of the things that I want to do this morning, and Rick and Shayla, once you guys make your way up here, is spend a little bit more time sharing an extended story of Rick and Shayla Laramie. And Tegan, can you grab the podium? I think you're coming out here, so it's not in the way. Actually, I will grab it as just get it off the stage so it's not blocking your view. But I had the privilege of sitting down with Rick over a cup of coffee a couple of weeks ago as he began to share a story that happened while I was on sabbatical. In fact, it was one of the few things that I heard about. I heard a little glimpse of it while I was on sabbatical. So will you welcome Rick and Shayla? So for those who don't know you guys, how did you guys get to Grace Fishers and how long have you been here?
So we've been at Grace Fishers for almost 9 years. We had been at a different church and really just felt God calling us to a closer relationship with Him, and we weren't able to find it through that church. So we were sort of new to Indiana still at this point, and we had just met a handful of people that were all in different areas of our lives, and there was just something different about them, and the only connecting factor was that they all went to Grace Church. So we tried it.
Cool.
And we loved it.
And you guys have been here for 9 years. And then, so that's just a little background. But Rick, something happened a few months ago. And maybe kind of give us a little background on what happened.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm a little nervous up here. first, I do want to say I'm free with the mic, right? Joey and Rob have said that, so I can do what I want. But I want to thank all my brothers and sisters, everybody who's out there that prayed for me during that time. I don't want to be up here and forget that. So I got into mountain biking. You can see on the slide, those are my sons. They're big into mountain biking, so I joined them last October. Bought a bike and started riding. So 2 months ago, I was on a trail in Anderson, not with my sons, but with somebody else, and I went off something called the pier. It's about a 5 to 6 foot launch. And I wasn't ready for it. And so I went off the pier, and it ended very badly. I crashed pretty severely. I laid on the ground. I knew I was broken, and so the guy I was with just told him to call for help, call 911. And in the moment, and I thought about this. I wasn't going to say this, but with Kevin saying we need somebody to motivate us, he looked at me and said, "Get up, we need to go." So we're in the middle of the woods. So we did, and I did. I stood up. Still don't know how, but I stood up and I walked out. And there was a moment that in the woods, there was an area that we walked into, and there's 5 trailheads, and we didn't know where to go. So we're kind of lost, no cell phone service. And he got a hold of somebody that he knew and knew which path to put us on. And so got us on that path. And I didn't know this either, but the same person he called immediately came to us and just jumped in the car. Are you there? Okay. Jumped in the car, jumped in the truck.
Connor, their son, is running audio, so I don't know. Maybe he was like, maybe he wanted, like, Dad, that's enough.
Time to wrap it up, right?
I know my kids wish they had audio control at home for me. Like, Dad, we don't need another story. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's good. But jumped in the car and immediately came. And as I'm walking out, lumbering out, they came running down the trail to meet us. So after that, I don't know if you want me to keep going here.
Yeah, keep going.
So we end up taking an ambulance to the hospital. I broke my collarbone, 8 ribs, punctured a lung, and I broke my thumb. And it was a humbling experience, just to go from being able to do something to not being able to do anything. Couldn't even lift my head in the hospital. Spent 11 days in the hospital, was full of ups and downs and almost and challenges. And I'd be happy if this stirs anything in anybody that you want to have a conversation, I'd be happy to share in more detail. Kevin and I talked for a couple hours.
Yeah.
So yeah.
In the midst of that hospital stay in particular, well, you saw God's faithfulness from the moment you were walking up the trail, but you guys both experienced God's faithfulness there in the hospital and all the events surrounding him in the recovery, and you guys can both answer what that looked like.
Sure. So it was hard. It was a hard thing to go through. It was scary. There were some setbacks and some moments that we weren't sure he was going to make it. I was going to make it through without crying.
It's okay.
But I think what stood out so much to both of us was how our Grace Fishers family just showed up. Mm-hmm. I'm not great at asking for help, and I'm not great at accepting help, but no one asked us, what do you need? They just showed up and did it. And the days that were the hardest and we were at our worst, we were never alone. There was always someone or multiple people there crying with us, praying with us, helping us to laugh at times that we really needed to laugh. And I walked out of the pre-op room from Rick's first surgery, and a woman from my women's group was just sitting in the waiting room with a bag of snacks. She didn't ask to come, she was just there, and she sat with me. And I think that really is what carried us through. I've said this before, I don't think I've ever felt as loved in my entire life as I have felt the last 2 months.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that and say the same thing. Just the community we felt in all those moments. You know, there was times when it hurt me to laugh. I mean, it did for weeks, a month. It hurt me to laugh, but we're laughing in the hospital. You know, we had the people around us supporting us and just bringing love and bringing joy. And there was a couple moments that we were alone in the hospital room, and I'm not an emotional person, but I'm weeping because I feel God's presence and His love through all of those people. the amount of prayers, I could feel the prayers. And it was just really impactful.
So you guys experienced an incredible sense of community and people coming around you. That was partly the result of some decisions that you had made earlier. You know, I don't know how long it took you guys to get involved, but what are some of those decisions as you guys look back that you say, I'm glad we did this because it resulted in a different kind of connection here at Grace Fishers?
So really just getting involved. I think for my first step was women's group. That felt safe, I guess, not as intimidating. But once I got here and the more I was involved, the more I wanted to be. So it took a little bit because, you know, everyone feels like life is full, right? No one has time for one more thing. But so it did take a minute before I signed up to volunteer. But I'm so grateful that we did. I think when I originally signed up, I volunteer at the info desk. And when I originally signed up because the church needed help, right? I'm volunteering to help the church. But what I didn't realize was how much I would get out of it, just from the connections and being here. And I mean, I told Kevin this morning, one of my favorite things to do is stand at the info desk and watch everyone walk in, because there's just genuine joy and love and hugs and laughter, and people are just happy to be here and happy to see each other. And I am just really grateful that I get to be a part of that.
Yeah, and I'm a typical male that doesn't get involved. You know, I'm good. I can come on Sunday and it's fine. But it was years ago that I came to men's group, started there, and then after that, it was when we launched as an independent church. And I remember, you know, Shayla and I were sitting up there, and Joey was, you know, up here, you know, saying, if you feel led, there's a card, fill out the card, fill out the card. And it was just this repetitive that I just felt God, tugging at my heart and saying, okay, this is the time, and we need to do it. So we did it. So I volunteer also at the info desk and then the security station. But, you know, that's part of it, but it's also men's groups. It's just getting to know your neighbor, just saying hi to somebody, and just the longer you're here, and that's anywhere. You know, the longer you're here, the longer you're seeing, the more you know people. So my encouragement and what made this whole event so much easier is that we stepped in a long time ago. You know, if we did that 3 months ago, it wouldn't have been the same for us. So we got to get through that, and maybe we would have gotten through that anyways, but we got to get through that easily, or not, I shouldn't say easily, but supported. So if there's something that you're waiting for, do it now.
Final word, any last thoughts, just as you guys think about your story and have you seen God show up, or maybe there's something else you want to say to people here at Grace Fishers?
I'd like to thank all of them,
Okay.
Just long list.
Yeah, well, you can name names if you want.
Well, I couldn't, I'd forget somebody,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm not
Okay.
going to. But no, just so many, and I see them all here, and a lot of them I ride with, and thank you.
Well, would you thank Rick and Shayla for joining us on stage this morning? Thank you. Stories can challenge and change us if we let them in. And Rick and Shayla have a story of God's faithfulness, and we all, if we take the time to reflect on it and share it with one another. And so I want to challenge us to do that as a church family. In fact, as we wrap up this Level Up series, my hope is that during the past few weeks, you've discovered some way that God is inviting you to level up, to step into a deeper place of relationship with Him. Or maybe you need to get connected so that you're not alone in doing life. Maybe you need to step in to serve and experience the blessings that you'll receive from that. Or maybe, as Nathaniel talked about last week, you need to continue to grow in your generosity. And I think for all of us, as we begin to trust God with who we are and what he's called us to, we can experience more of his perspective and more of his life. And our stories are a part of that. Now, one story, and it's really the most important story of all, is the story that God spent thousands of years setting up. And it's the story of Jesus, his life, his death, and his resurrection. And it's the ultimate picture of God's provision and faithfulness for us. And Jesus, as he gathered with his disciples for one last time before he was going to be betrayed and crucified, he invited them to remember the story, and he invited us to remember the story. And so as he gathered, he took bread and he broke it and he passed it among his disciples. And he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And he invited them to eat. And then later he did the same with the cup. And we're going to enter into a time where we're going to remember God's faithfulness. And we've got time. We're not in a rush this morning. And so we're going to give you space to reflect. Maybe you need to be reminded of God's faithfulness in the midst of something difficult that you're going through. Or maybe you just want to say thank you to him. Or maybe you just want to reflect on the bread and the cup and the picture that is of God's blessing for us as his people. And so we're just going to enter into a time, and you take the elements as God leads you. And then in a few minutes, the worship team is going to come up, and they're going to close us in a final song together.